The wind that swept across the prairie that winter had a mean edge to it, dry, slicing, relentless. It peeled paint from clapboards and drove fine dust through chinks in thick stone walls. It howled through the cottonwoods, along the creek beds, and blew the snow sideways for weeks on end, blanketing fences and piling up against doors till men had to dig their way out just to feed the stock. The ranchers of Rock Bluff, Wyoming were used to it. This was their world, hard, weather-carved, unforgiving. They built their homes like bunkers, stone and mortar, thick timber with roofs heavy enough to hold a man's weight and walls so solid they could stop a stray bullet. That winter, though, something felt different. The cold bit deeper, nights stretched longer, and in the middle of it all stood a structure no one had expected to survive the season, let alone outperform every other dwelling in the valley. It sat near the edge of the settlement, a low shack made of lath and plaster so thin you could see the lantern light inside through the gaps in the boards. No chimney, no stone hearth, no log beams, no insulation, at least not the kind ranchers trusted. They'd laughed when they first saw it go up in October, called it a joke, said the wind would tear it apart before December, or if not that, the frost would shatter its walls. The man who built it didn't argue. He didn't defend it. He just kept working, quiet, methodical, stacking strange materials no one had ever seen out here. When asked what he was doing, he'd say, "Trying to stay warm is all." That was the first time anyone had really noticed Eli Burnham. He was a new arrival, though not young. Grey in his beard, a long scar from cheek to jaw, and hands too clean for a rancher. No one knew where he came from, but the way he moved told of an old soldier or maybe an engineer. He had a limp that didn't slow him down much, and eyes that measured things constantly. Distances, shadows, people. He'd shown up at the start of the fall cattle drive, bought a parcel of land everyone else had passed over, dry and wind-whipped, and a mile off the main creek. Folks figured he was another fool chasing cheap land before the snow came. But when the drive ended and the Cowboys came back, they found that shack already halfway done, rising fast in its strange angular way. No logs, no bricks, just narrow wooden slats framed tight, a canvas wrap that looked like it came off a tent, and some kind of shiny sheeting he tacked between layers like he was building a sandwich out of wood, cloth and tin. Rancher boys rode out to see it, made jokes about how it might float away in the wind, how he must be building a coffin for himself ahead of schedule. Burnham didn't laugh. He kept working, and when he finished, he did something no one expected. He invited them inside. It wasn't fancy, just one room, a table, a chair, and a cot, but it was warm. Not just warm from a fire, it was still air, soft heat, like a place that had held warmth for days. There was no fire going, no stove running, just heat stored in the walls somehow. The ranch hands left confused, maybe a little spooked. They reported back that Burnham had some sort of secret trick, maybe using army gear or mining stuff that made his shack heat itself. The older men laughed again, said wait till the first blizzard, then they'd see how clever that paper-thin shack really was. The first blizzard came early, late November. It dropped 3 feet of snow and brought temperatures that didn't rise above zero for a week straight. Pipes froze in the bunkhouses. A stone chimney cracked clean through at the Kershaw Ranch, and smoke backed into the parlor for days. Men burned twice their usual wood, just to keep the walls from sweating frost. And through it all, Burnham's shack stood untouched. Not a shingle out of place. No smoke rising from it either. Yet when one of the ranchers rode by to check, they saw Burnham sitting at a window, reading by daylight, shirt sleeves rolled up, no coat in sight. That was when the laughter stopped. Something about it didn't sit right with the others. Stone homes were supposed to be the best. Thick walls, heavy insulation, all that mass to trap heat. They'd built them the way their fathers had, the way you were supposed to out here. But somehow, that little shack built from scraps and silence was warmer, without even a chimney or fire in sight. Whispers started. Maybe it was dangerous. Maybe he had some sort of coal stove or chemical heater inside. Something bound to explode. A few muttered about government secrets or war tech. But one man, Sam Henley, a rancher whose wife had frostbite on 2 fingers already, rode out and asked Burnham straight, "What the hell did you build?" Burnham didn't answer right away. He just opened the door and let Sam in. It was 20 below outside. Inside, it felt like 55. Not hot, but comfortable. More than livable. No fire, no stove, just still air, radiant warmth coming from the walls and floor. Burnham gestured around. "I built it right," he said. That was the moment everything changed. Henley brought back word, and soon others came too, at first under the pretense of checking on a neighbor, then openly curious. Burnham never turned anyone away. He didn't brag, he didn't charge. He just let them look, let them ask, and if they stayed long enough, He told them how it worked. It started with what he called thermal balance. Every house in Rock Bluff had a stove or a fireplace. They burned wood or coal and poured out heat, but that heat went one way, up and out. Burnham's shack trapped it, not with mass, but with reflection. The shiny stuff he'd nailed between the slats? It was a radiant barrier, something he'd seen used in troop tents during the war, a material that reflected infrared heat back into the space instead of letting it escape. The canvas wrapping wasn't just cloth, it was oil-treated, layered, with a vapor barrier underneath to trap air, and the strange shape of the shack, angled walls, a low ceiling, was designed to minimize volume and maximize convection flow. Heat didn't rise and escape, it moved in a loop, slowly, circulating through baffles Burnham had built into the ceiling and walls. No fancy machines, just design. But the real trick, he said, was understanding where the heat went. Most houses fought the cold like a battle, burn hotter, block drafts, seal tight. Burnham thought differently. He treated the cold like water, flowing in wherever there was a weakness. His job wasn't to generate more heat, it was to stop the leaks. Every joint in the shack was doubled, every corner insulated with scrap wool he'd scavenged. The floor was raised and insulated with straw and packed earth. The roof had 3 layers, each separated by airspace, and the reflective barriers made sure that every bit of heat he did generate, through cooking, through his own body, stayed inside as long as possible. It sounded impossible, too simple, too strange, but it worked, and word spread. By January, ranchers who'd spent their lives laughing at newfangled ideas were riding out with notepads, asking to measure wall thickness, scribbling sketches of his layout. Burnham let them. He didn't seem to care about credit or pride. "Cold don't care what your walls are made of," he told one old rancher. "It only cares where the heat goes." That was when the resentment started. Some of the men couldn't take it, couldn't bear the idea that their grand stone ranch houses, built with sweat and passed down like heirlooms, were inferior to a shack built by a stranger with no ties to the land. They began talking behind his back again, saying he must have cheated, must have brought in gear from back east, or had some kind of hidden stove in the floor. One man claimed he saw wires, said the shack must be heated with some secret electric rig. Burnham denied nothing. He just kept living, quietly, warmly, while the rest of the town froze in their pride. But something darker was brewing. A week into February, after a particularly bitter storm, a small group of ranchers rode out after sundown. They claimed it was to verify Burnham wasn't breaking any land use rules. But when they arrived, they knocked hard, forced the door when he didn't answer right away. Inside they found him sick, pale, bundled on his cot under layers of wool. Pneumonia maybe, or something worse. He'd been living warm, but not invincible. The house had kept him alive so far, but the sickness had come for him all the same. They stood inside that warm little shack and saw for themselves there was no secret heater, no coal fire, no hidden wires, just layers, barriers, careful design, and a man now fighting for his breath. They left in silence. Some didn't speak of that night again. Others whispered that the cold had tried and failed to take him through his walls, so it came for his lungs instead. But Burnham wasn't finished. Not yet. The news spread by dawn. Burnham was down, sick. A few claimed he was dying. Others said it was just the flu, but no one could deny the irony. The man who built the warmest shelter in Rock Bluff, who outwitted wind and frost with walls no thicker than a saddle blanket, was now bundled in quilts, wheezing like an old mule under the eaves of his miracle shack. For some, it confirmed what they'd wanted to believe all along, that warmth didn't equal survival, that no design, no trick, no material could substitute for grit. But for others, it only deepened the mystery. If he'd gotten sick in that house, what chance did they have in theirs? 3 days passed before anyone rode out again. This time, it was Clara Henley who went, not her husband. She packed broth and boiled roots in her saddlebag and made the hour-long ride herself. Clara had lost 2 brothers to the cold, one to fever, the other to a lung infection after sleeping too long beside a drafty wall in a bunkhouse no one had dared call home. She'd grown up on the high plains. She knew what winter did, knew that sometimes warmth wasn't enough. But what caught her off guard when she stepped into Burnham's shack that morning wasn't just the heat, it was the stillness. The air didn't move, yet it wasn't stuffy. The temperature held steady, like someone had turned a dial and locked it there. And Burnham was alive. Barely. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His face was drawn, lips dry. He tried to rise when he saw her, but collapsed back against the cot with a cough that rattled like broken glass. Clara spooned broth between his lips and sat with him while the light shifted on the walls. For hours she said nothing, just watched the flickers from the oil lamp bounce off the silvery fabric in the seams, felt the way the air held steady without fire or fan. She listened to him breathe, ragged but steady, and then she looked around and began to see. She saw the double-layered canvas on the ceiling, how it sagged slightly, weighted to trap warm air below. She saw the thick straw matting tucked between wall studs behind narrow wood planks, the patchwork of animal skins tacked into corners where air might try to leak. She examined the floorboards, notched tight with no visible gaps, the crawl space beneath them cleverly vented, but insulated with layers of what looked like wool and dried pine needles. Every square inch of the shack was doing something. Nothing was idle. Burnham didn't speak until late in the afternoon. His voice was cracked and weak, but there was still that flicker behind his eyes, the same flicker Sam Henley had seen weeks earlier, the glint of someone who knew something. "They'll tear it down," he whispered. Clara leaned in. "Who will?" he coughed. "They're afraid of what it means," and she understood, not just the fear of something new, but what it exposed. If this little shack built from cloth, air, and trash could outlast the stone homes of the richest ranchers in the valley, what did that say about everything they believed, everything they passed down as wisdom? By the time Clara rode back that evening, her cheeks red with wind and resolve, she wasn't just carrying news of Burnham's survival, she carried a warning. "He's not done," she told Sam, "and you'd better decide whose side you're on before the thaw comes." The thaw came late that year. March rolled in with storms that hadn't been forecast by anyone but the sky itself. 3 back-to-back blizzards pounded Rock Bluff in the span of 10 days. Roads vanished, herds scattered, chickens froze on the roost. One ranch lost half its sheep in a single night when a stone barn's roof cracked under the snow and collapsed. Another saw a ranch hand lose both feet after getting trapped in a shed where the lock had frozen shut. Through it all, Burnham's shack stood, snow-packed to the windows but warm inside. Clara and a few others took turns checking on him, bringing food, helping him sit up, pour water, breathe better. Each visit revealed another detail, another design choice that shouldn't have mattered but did. The windows, for example. There were only 2, both facing south. They weren't glass, but treated parchment laminated with oil and resin, translucent, not transparent, designed to capture sunlight during the day and radiate it slowly inward. Behind each one was a set of hinged shutters, fitted with strips of wool, which could be closed tight at night to seal out the cold. And above each window, a narrow shelf extended outward, angled to catch low winter sunlight and bounce it downward through the parchment like a magnifying lens. In the middle of a storm, these little touches seemed laughable, but during clearer days, the shack stayed 5 to 7 degrees warmer for no additional effort. Passive heat, Burnham called it. Ranchers had scoffed at the idea. Heat came from flame, from burning wood, from fuel and muscle. But Burnham had dared ask a different question. What if you didn't have to make more heat? Just keep the heat you already had. That shift in thinking unsettled people. Because if it was true, then everything they'd built was wrong. By April, Burnham could stand on his own again. Clara and her brother Micah helped him step outside for the first time in weeks. The snow had receded in patches. Mud slicked the road out of town. But his shack, aside from a few water stains on the outer wrap, was intact. Wind had scuffed the paint. An old seam in the canvas needed patching, but it had held. No leaks, no collapse, just stubborn, quiet survival. And it was then, standing there, blinking in the sun, that Burnham did something no one expected. He offered to share everything. He called it the plan. Not blueprints, not exact dimensions, but a set of principles, a way of seeing buildings not as monuments to strength, but as systems. He mapped it out with charcoal on an old grain sack, drawing diagrams, writing terms in the margins: thermal loop, radiant bounce, insulated convection, airtight seam, vapor control. He talked about layering like you'd layer clothes, base layer for wicking, mid for insulation, outer for wind resistance. A building was no different. It wasn't about thickness, it was about behavior. Word got out, and it split the town. Some leaned in, hungry for change. Young homesteaders, poor families, settlers on the margins. They began copying pieces of his shack, adding internal shutters, double-layered ceilings, floor insulation made from old burlap and straw. They saw their fuel costs drop. Their kids stopped coughing. One woman said her baby slept through the night for the first time since November, but others resisted. They mocked the changes, called it Burnham's baby house, said it was all fluff, a trick, a fad. The real men would keep burning wood and braving the cold like their fathers had. Then came the fire. It started in early May, when the weather finally broke. The Davis homestead, one of the largest in the valley, lost its main house to a flue fire. Sparks leapt from a chimney, caught in the rafters. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. The stone walls stood, but everything inside had cooked. The family escaped, but barely. And as they stood outside, watching smoke curl up into the bright spring sky, someone asked why it had spread so fast. The answer: draft, negative pressure from bad insulation, a chimney that drew too hard, too fast, a roof not sealed against internal heat leaks. And that was the final straw. That week, 5 families asked Burnham for help. They brought scraps, asked questions, sat with him for hours while he redrew his plan on flour sacks and canvas. Some even offered to pay him. He declined. "I'm not building your house," he said, "but I'll teach you how." Soon the outskirts of Rock Bluff buzzed with construction. New shacks rose, not identical to Burnham's, but inspired. Variants, adaptations, materials changed, but the principles held: airtight layers, passive heat, controlled airflow, and always a design that treated warmth not as a byproduct of fire, but as a resource to be stored, directed, and respected. Of course, not everyone liked it. The old guard, the big ranchers, the men with stone houses and money in the bank, watched with clenched jaws. They'd mocked the shack, dismissed it. Now they saw neighbors copying it, improving on it. It was an affront, not just to tradition, but to pride. And so one night in late June, someone tried to burn Burnham's shack to the ground. But that night would be remembered for more than the fire. It began with the faint smell of smoke, charcoal, pine pitch, something oily beneath. Burnham had been asleep, if lightly, his body still, recovering from the long sickness. His shack, sensitive to every fluctuation of air and heat, responded first. The change in temperature along the ceiling, an unusual downward creep, woke him before the smoke reached his lungs. He sat up slowly, heartbeat thudding with the delayed response of a man not quite healed, and listened. There was a hiss, not inside, outside at the rear corner near the eaves. Then the unmistakable crack of dry straw catching fire. He was on his feet by the time the second flame took. Outside, they'd used a mixture, kerosene and straw, soaked bundles packed under the rear side wall and beneath the canvas skirt near the base. Old timber from a fence line, broken in half, leaned like kindling against the support beams. Primitive, yes, but deliberate. The kind of fire set by someone who didn't want a warning blaze, just a fast burn, a kill fire. But they hadn't counted on the shack's design. No air vents near the ground, no open floor gaps to pull oxygen into the walls. Every seam tightly sealed, the canvas treated with an oil-clay mix that didn't catch flame easily. The outer shell smoldered, it peeled, but it did not ignite. And by the time the fire had crawled halfway up the back wall, Burnham had already kicked open the front door, thrown his body weight into a stack of snowmelt barrels, and doused the side of his home in a wave of ice water so frigid it hissed on contact with the heat. By the time Clara Henley and 2 other settlers arrived, woken by the sight of distant orange flickers bouncing off the low clouds, the fire was out. The shack was scorched but standing, and Burnham, pale and panting in the mud, stood holding a shovel like a weapon, eyes scanning the tree line for whoever had done it. They never caught the arsonist. But in Rock Bluff, secrets didn't last long. The first rumor pointed toward Caleb Brandt, eldest son of one of the oldest ranching families in the region. He'd lost cattle to cold that winter, lost a younger brother to infection, and lost face when his own bunkhouse flooded after snowmelt pushed through the hill behind his home. People said he blamed Burnham for making him look foolish, that the shack had stolen attention from his family's estate, the one his grandfather built with stone hauled 30 miles by ox. Whether it was Caleb or not, no one could say for sure. But what mattered was the line that had now been crossed. No longer just words, no longer laughter and quiet mockery. Someone had tried to erase Burnham's legacy by fire. It didn't work. If anything, it cemented the shack's place in town history. A man builds a miracle home, and it survives the worst winter anyone can remember. Then it survives fire. And the next morning, he doesn't complain, doesn't call a meeting or demand justice. He just goes back to patching his walls, soaking new cloth in clay, tacking it back into place with slow, methodical movements. But the community saw. They saw, and something changed. That week, 3 of the families who'd been experimenting with Burnham's techniques offered to help rebuild the damaged wall. They brought scraps, old canvas, spare nails, leftover wool batting. They worked without pay. Clara helped organize it. Micah brought lumber. Even Sam Henley, quiet, skeptical Sam, came with tools and took silent instruction from a man still pale from fever. In 2 days, the damage was gone, and a new sign hung above the door: "Heat stays home." It was a phrase Burnham had written on one of his diagrams, meant to describe the principles of radiant heat retention, but it had become something more, a motto, a quiet defiance. The summer that followed saw a transformation across Rock Bluff. Burnham's influence spread, though he never demanded it. He simply was, and the town began to orbit around the knowledge he offered. When someone lost a barn to rot, they didn't rebuild it the same way. They asked Burnham about airflow, about vapor barriers, about why certain corners stayed damp even in the dry months. When a widow's chimney collapsed, The town gathered to build her a new one, not of brick, but of cob and clay, mixed with sand and straw, layered for insulation, modeled after Burnham's central hearth. He became, in a way, the town's reluctant architect, not by title, not by vote, just by presence. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. There remained a core group, wealthier ranchers, men who had built their homes as statements, foundations dug deep, stone trucked in from out of state, imported stoves and iron hearths that cost a year's wages for most. These were men who'd spent their lives proving something, to fathers, to wives, to other ranchers. To be told by a stranger with a limp and a canvas shack that their grand homes leaked heat like sieves was unthinkable. And so, quietly, they resisted. They warned others not to listen, claimed Burnham's designs were untested, dangerous, that double walls trapped mold, that airflow designs were unmanly. One even said Burnham's ideas smelled of the city, like he'd read too many books and not spent enough time under the stars. But their protests fell flat, because as the heat of summer rose and the stone homes turned into ovens, Burnham's shack stayed cool, cooler even than the earth-floored cellars many used to store perishables, with no fan, no ice, just smart design. The trick was in the roof. It had baffled people at first. Unlike most gabled roofs that pitched high to shed snow, Burnham's was low, nearly flat, with a slight angle to the north. The surface was layered, wood planks, then reflective foil, then a thick mat of straw covered in lime wash. It didn't look like much, but it worked. In winter it held snow in a dense, unmoving layer that added insulation. In summer the lime wash reflected heat, and the baffle vents at the roof's edge pulled hot air up and out like a siphon. Inside, the temperature held steady. Nights were cool, days tolerable. People who stepped inside during July heat left shaking their heads. It shouldn't work, they said. But it does. By late summer, Burnham had begun drawing up more formal plans. He called it the passive cabin. He'd sketched versions for single-room homes, two-room extensions, even barns, each one adapted to different materials, stone, wood, canvas, depending on what the builder had. But every version followed the same tenets: airtight seams, radiant barriers, thermal mass, solar orientation, and airflow control. Simple in principle, revolutionary in practice, and yet trouble still loomed. That August, the county inspector came through Rock Bluff. He was a wiry man in a stiff coat, carrying a clipboard and a list. His job was to evaluate structures for compliance, especially any new ones built with non-standard methods. Burnham's shack was top of the list. So was the barn Clara Henley had built with layered straw and mud walls, and the two homes downriver that now featured roof venting systems Burnham had helped design. The inspector spent a day touring. He frowned at the straw insulation. He prodded the parchment windows. He sneered at the floorless chimney hearths and excessive ventilation systems. Not to code, he said. No proper framing, no approved materials. These structures are not certified. And with that, he declared Burnham's shack and the others unfit for habitation. The town reeled. To accept that decision meant tearing down homes that had proven themselves through the worst winter in memory. Homes that had protected babies, kept old men alive, saved firewood, and stood against fire itself. The anger was immediate. Clara organized a town meeting. Dozens showed. Burnham was asked to speak, but he declined. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about whether we get to decide how we survive." The meeting turned into a standoff. Ranchers who had once mocked Burnham now defended him. Mothers spoke of their children sleeping through the night. Old men talked about not waking up with frost on their blankets. Even some of the stone home ranchers, those who had resisted, admitted they'd made small changes, better shutters, new insulation, because of what they'd seen. And in the end, the town did something bold. They voted unanimously to reject the inspector's ruling. They drafted a letter, signed by every head of household, declaring that any home that kept its people safe, warm, and alive was fit to stand. They called it the Rock Bluff Standard. It wasn't legal, it wasn't recognized by the county, but it was theirs. The inspector left the next morning, furious, but he left alone. Burnham's shack remained, and quietly other towns began to hear the story. By the time the first frost dusted the fields of Rock Bluff in the fall of that same year, the story of the paper-thin shack had spread beyond the borders of the valley. Word traveled by mail wagons, by trappers moving between settlements, and by ranchers visiting distant kin. It didn't spread like wildfire. It crept, seeped into conversations over whiskey, slipped between pages of letters, caught interest in quiet corners of homesteads where cold had long been accepted as an immovable truth. Most who heard it didn't believe it. They laughed the way Rock Bluff had once laughed. But a few didn't. One of those was a man named Josiah Craig, a surveyor working east of the Bighorns. He had no stake in Rock Bluff, didn't know Burnham or anyone in the valley, but he'd grown up in a dugout cabin where the frost bloomed on the ceiling like mold and he'd watched his mother die of pneumonia when the chimney failed during a sleet storm in 1872. When the story of Burnham's shack crossed his desk, a report of a structure that used no fire, no heavy insulation, and yet stayed warmer than stone, he didn't scoff. He requested drawings. When he got them, he built a scale model in his barn. By early December, he was living in a full-sized replica on his own land, just outside Sheridan. His neighbors thought he'd gone mad, until the blizzard came. It struck in the second week of December, a white wall of ice and snow, relentless for 4 days. Most homes lost power. Woodpiles were buried. In towns like Dayton and Banner, families slept in barns beside livestock for warmth. But Josiah Craig's odd little cabin held firm. No fire, no smoke. Just layers, just principles. He emerged after the storm, warm and intact, and when people came to see, to verify it with their own eyes, he welcomed them in, just like Burnham had. From that moment on, Burnham's design ceased to be a curiosity and became something else entirely, a blueprint for resilience. Back in Rock Bluff, the coming winter was met not with dread, but with preparation. The town had changed. The divide between old guard and new had blurred. Even those who once scoffed had made small changes. Shutters with wool linings, underfloor straw insulation, internal chimneys with thermal mass. No one admitted to copying Burnham directly. They called it just smart ranching, but the influence was undeniable. Burnham himself remained quiet. He didn't preach. He didn't organize. He taught when asked, nodded when thanked, and spent most of his days repairing the scorch marks on the rear wall of his shack, patching with newer, better material he'd been testing. He called it quilt clay, a weave of burlap soaked in a lime starch mix, then pressed between vapor membranes and cured in the sun. It was lighter, more durable, and even more reflective. He tested each patch with a candle, watching how the heat moved along the surface. "If you can shape the flow," he told Clara once, "you can shape survival." But winter doesn't care about blueprints. It came in early that year, colder than expected. Wind shrieked through the cottonwoods and froze the creeks solid before the end of November. Snow fell in sheets, thick and wet, then froze into crust. Livestock huddled in sheds. Children were kept home from school. And then, in the first week of January, disaster struck. The bluff behind the Miller homestead collapsed. It had been unstable for years. A shallow rise with poor drainage, packed clay that absorbed meltwater and froze unevenly. That winter, with the rapid freeze-thaw cycles, it cracked. A chunk the size of a freight car slid down into the rear of the Millers' main house, crushing the back wall and part of the chimney. No one was killed, but the house was unlivable, and in temperatures hovering near 20, that meant something close to death. It was Clara who rode for Burnham. She found him kneeling outside his shack, checking the airflow through one of his roof vents. His beard was rimmed with frost. His hands were wrapped in cloth, but moving with purpose. She dismounted, breath heaving in the cold. "The Millers lost their house," she said. "We need help." He didn't hesitate. Within the hour, Burnham had packed what little he had: tools, spare layers of canvas, rolls of reflective foil, 3 jars of pine sap adhesive. Together they rode to the Miller place. Others followed. Micah brought rope and blankets. The Henleys brought food. By dusk, a camp had been established 30 yards from the wreckage, and Burnham had begun sketching in the snow with a stick. "What are we doing?" someone asked. "Building warmth," he said. They worked through the night. Burnham directed them, not with the authority of a leader, but the quiet focus of a man who knew. Every movement had purpose. Canvas walls rose in tight rings. Layered wool was stuffed between surfaces. Branches from nearby evergreens were cut and stacked to create windbreaks. A stove was improvised from a clay-lined barrel, and always the same mantra: seal the seams, slow the flow, keep the heat home. By dawn, the Millers had a structure, not a house, not a tent, but something in between, a temporary home that held warmth like a held breath. They moved in, survived the storm that followed, and when it ended, they didn't rebuild their old house. They asked Burnham to help design a new one. That was the tipping point. Word of the collapse and the miracle cabin spread fast. A journalist passing through caught wind of the story and stopped to interview the Millers, then Burnham. He was skeptical, but the cold convinced him. When he stepped inside the temporary shelter and found it warmer than the inn where he was staying, he sat down and began to write. His article ran a week later in the Cheyenne Courier, under the headline, "The Shack That Shamed Stone. One Man's Warmer-Than-Fire Cabin Design May Change Frontier Architecture." And just like that, the world noticed. Letters came, first from nearby towns, then from distant states. Architects wrote, engineers, homesteaders, ranchers, even military officers, asking for clarification, for diagrams, for instructions. Some offered money, some offered land. Burnham turned most of them away. "I didn't do it to sell," he told Clara. "I did it to live." But the pressure grew. A delegation arrived from Fort Laramie, officers in stiff coats and skeptical expressions. They had orders to evaluate the design for potential use in frontier outposts, especially those suffering from supply issues during long winters. Burnham let them inspect every inch of the shack. He answered every question, and when they left, one captain turned back at the door and said, "It's too clever to be accidental." Burnham smiled. Nothing accidental about staying alive. Then came the final challenge, the one no material, no seal, no design could prevent. Burnham's heart began to fail. It started as fatigue, then shortness of breath. By early February, he could no longer work more than an hour without sitting. He coughed less, but every cough came from somewhere deeper. The long winter illness hadn't left clean. Clara saw it first, then Micah. Burnham dismissed it. "Just age," he said. "The fire burns down in all of us eventually." But the town knew better. They began visiting more often, bringing him broth, helping him maintain the shack. Children from the school came with questions. He'd sit on a stool, grey blanket over his knees, sketching with chalk on the floor, while little hands scribbled notes in the margins of old flour sacks. And then one day, he stopped drawing. Clara found him asleep at his table, pen still in hand, the last sketch half finished, a cross-section of a new design, meant for a hillside cabin with a wind scoop built into the rear wall. His breath was shallow. She sat with him until the light faded. Burnham never woke. The town buried him 3 days later, just after the snow melted off the south-facing ridge. They carried him up on a handmade sled, wrapped in wool and canvas, and laid him beneath a cottonwood where the wind couldn't reach. The grave was marked with a simple stone etched with 3 words. He built warmth, but his work didn't end there. They say a man dies twice, once when his heart stops, and again when his name is spoken for the last time. But in Rock Bluff, and far beyond its wind-scoured ridges, the name Burnham didn't fade. It grew. It took root like cottonwood at the banks of a stubborn creek, spreading where no one expected it to, at first in whispers, then in blueprints. Not just among those who had knelt in the dust to help patch his scorched shack that spring, but among strangers who had never seen his eyes or heard the low, careful rhythm of his voice. The morning after his burial, Clara Henley unlocked the door to Burnham's shack, not out of curiosity or obligation, but because she knew someone had to. The wind was rising that day, cold with memory, and the town stood quiet in the early light as she stepped across the threshold and into the space he'd shaped with a lifetime of quiet resistance to the elements. Everything inside was as he'd left it. The straw-wrapped chimney, the hand-scribed diagrams hanging from nails, the bundles of new materials waiting for his hands to test them. The shack smelled of pine resin, cured canvas, and something faintly metallic, like the memory of fire. She stood there a long time. Later that week, the town voted unanimously to preserve the structure as it was, not as a museum, but as a working model. Children were brought to see it, to touch the walls, to ask questions. Every answer they received was tied not to invention, but to intention. Burnham hadn't created something new. He'd remembered something old, something forgotten in the rush to build taller, thicker, heavier. That warmth wasn't measured in inches of stone or pounds of mortar. It was measured in how wisely you built. The passive cabin movement began quietly. At first, it was just a few ranchers in Rock Bluff sharing techniques in letters, diagrams copied and mailed to cousins in Utah, or neighbors in Nebraska. Then it became meetings, gatherings of homesteaders and carpenters and masons who wanted to learn. Men and women sat in barns, in repurposed churches, in field tents, swapping stories not about how to fight winter, but how to work with it. Thermal mass became a household term. Airtight construction wasn't just for city folk, it was frontier logic, survival refined. By the following winter, over 24 homes had been built across Wyoming using Burnham's core principles. The designs varied, some round, some long and low, some with basements dug into hillsides, and others lifted high with underfloor insulation made of dried cattail pulp and riverbank clay, but all of them shared the same spine: radiant reflection, controlled convection, layered barriers, and simplicity. And when the winter of '87 hit harder than any since Burnham's miracle shack had first been built, none of those homes failed. Not one. The Cheyenne Courier ran a follow-up, the shack that changed the West. They published a diagram on the front page, labeled it Burnham's Layered Wall. Below it, a quote from Clara: "He didn't build thick, he built smart, and smart lasts." Requests poured in, not just for blueprints, but for instruction, for lectures, for designs adapted to barns, schoolhouses, even train stations. Engineers began using Burnham's ideas to retrofit mining cabins. A prospector in Leadville claimed his crew had survived a whiteout because he'd lined their tent with canvas and foil packs, modeled after Burnham's wall designs. His statement was printed in the Colorado Sun. "We didn't freeze and we didn't burn a single stick of wood. We burned his name into our future instead." That winter, a group of school teachers from Laramie visited Rock Bluff. They sat with Clara and Micah and others who'd helped build the Miller's Emergency Shelter. They collected every surviving sketch and turned them into a book. Heat Stays Home, Frontier Wisdom from the Shack Builder. It was hand-bound, just 46 pages, printed with rough ink on recycled ledger paper. But within 5 years, over 10,000 copies had circulated. It became a staple in schools, in churches, in toolkits passed down through families. The ideas within weren't radical, they were practical. The book taught children how to patch cold spots with felt, how to angle eaves to catch winter light, how to layer straw between walls without trapping mold, and it did something else. It taught respect for those who built differently. Some towns resisted the change. They held to stone, to brick, to the old ways. They laughed as Rock Bluff once had. But winters do not honor laughter. They break what's brittle, and over time, even the doubters adapted. One town in Montana, battered by wind and fire, rebuilt its schoolhouse using Burnham's layout. That building stood for over 50 years. In Kansas, a traveling doctor began outfitting his mobile clinic with portable, heat-retaining wall panels based on the shack's design. In Idaho, missionaries used the techniques to build weather-resistant shelters for native communities where traditional structures had been forcibly replaced with drafty government cabins. The irony was bitter, but the warmth was real. Eventually, universities took notice. Engineers at the University of Colorado tested Burnham's designs in lab settings, measuring thermal retention against conventional cabins. Their findings were printed in national science journals. Low-mass, layered envelope structures with radiant barriers perform as well or better than high-mass masonry in sub-zero environments, provided design principles are rigorously applied. One professor, a Dr. Layton, visited Rock Bluff personally. He stood in Burnham's shack, ran his hand along the soot-stained rear wall where the arson fire had tried and failed to undo it, and simply said, "This is what architecture forgot." He helped fund a replica built on campus, where it was used for hands-on student training for over a decade. By the turn of the century, what began as ridicule, a shack thinner than a barn door, built by a limping man with quiet eyes, had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of a certain stubborn clarity. Burnham had not sought fame. He had not patented his designs, nor sought to profit from them. He had asked only one question: how do we build something that keeps us alive, even when the world tries to kill us? That question echoed into generations. In Rock Bluff, they kept telling the story, mothers to children, ranchers to greenhorns, teachers to students. Every winter, on the first night the snow stuck for good, Clara Henley would gather the young ones and walk them out to the shack. She'd light a lantern, push open the door, and let them feel the warmth inside. No fire, no heater, just a hush of air that had been sealed and preserved by design. She'd tell them he didn't fight the cold, he outthought it, and that's a kind of strength most men never learn. Years later, after Clara passed, and the Henley homestead was sold, the town formed a committee to maintain the shack. They added a second structure beside it, a learning center of sorts. They called it the Burnham School of Building. The name was carved in pine and hung over a door built with the same straw-clay composite Burnham had experimented with in his final weeks. Inside, children still trace the layers of the walls with their fingers, still ask why the windows face south, still marvel at the idea that warmth doesn't have to be earned through suffering. It can be designed. And outside, on a brass plaque nailed beside the original doorframe, are these words: "Cowboys laughed at his paper-thin shack until it stayed warmer than their stone ranch houses." He didn't shout, he didn't fight, he just built something better and let the winter prove him right. That winter still comes. It always will. But in Rock Bluff, the warmth stays home.